So I, we're, this is not for testing, but what does it mean to be a Jew? I now know he's a dispersion Jew, Orthodox, raised in a bilingual, bicultural, high educated, one of the few elite, highly educated PhDs in rabbinic literature. But what does it mean to be a Jew, I guess? You cut that, Mark, about the ones that you see in your work and your environment, New York, etc. When I land in Tel Aviv, I see a lot of one kind of Jew. Okay, I'm not disparaging either. I'm seeing more the liberal Jew. Okay, in Tel Aviv. When I go up to the Sea of Galilee, I experience a lot more orthodoxy, like on the Sabbath in Tiberias along the Sea of Galilee. The cars stop on Friday about 5:30. You know why? It's Shabbat, and elevators don't work anymore because you can't go up an elevator. Work is defined by orthodoxy. Can't go more than 6/10 of a mile. Can't ride an elevator. There you go. When I go to Jerusalem, wow, over 35% of the houses and lands of modern day Jerusalem have been bought out and inhabited by Orthodox Jews. It's been a systematic, they've been trying to recover Jerusalem for Orthodox Judaism. Now, they still got, of course, the issue of Palestinians, and that's part of the problem, perennial problem of Jerusalem, that blessed and cursed city, which is a place of hope and tears, both at the same time, of tragic history and great possibilities, all of the above. What does it mean to be a Jew? Well, the story of Judaism starts 2,000 years before Paul. Of course, Abraham, the father of the faithful, is the first major figure. I place him around the 20th century, right? Of course, 5 centuries later, when the descendants of Abraham have been slaves in Egypt because a Pharaoh arose that did not know Joseph, right? God sends Moses as a liberator and a lawgiver, and that happens around the 15th century. That's the early date. I go with that one. Others say 13th. And then there's the period of the judges, in which the God guides Joshua, and I'm just walking through Jewish history here, right? What does it mean to be a Jew? When you're a Jew in the first century, you have 2,000 years of history. And the period of the judges is not a good one. The problem is not about politics. It's about what kind of leaders you have. It's not the political system. It's some of the judges are no good. Some of them are just so short. Others are terrible. Joshua was a good leader, and he will say, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Is that right? And after that, it kind of goes downhill quickly, if not rapidly. And so they start thinking, the descendants of Abraham, that politics will fix it. So we want a king like everybody else. Nobody else had anything but monarchy in the 11th century. So in a sense, you can understand the Jews when they say, "Give us a king." So God through Samuel appoints King Saul as the first king of Israel. And he's the right man for the job. And he's tall and he's handsome. And he's from the tribe of Benjamin, by the way, which is the same tribe as Paul. Saul is his name because in the tribe of Benjamin, the greatest figure in the history of the Benjamites is Saul. And yet you have to ask them, now wait, if he's your greatest figure, do you remember how it ends? Because it doesn't end well. It's a tragic history of the right man for the job at the beginning, and absolutely, when you try to do things on your own, don't listen to God, well, it doesn't end well. David, of course, is anybody living in the first century under the Romans looks back 1,000 years before to David as the greatest moment in Jewish history. Jerusalem is the city of David. It's the Star of David. Everything points to David. David was not perfect. He committed sins, some atrocious ones, but he was different than Saul in that he repented. And so he'll be the man after God's own heart, right? Somehow you can make even big mistakes and live to serve God in spite of it all. He has blood on his hands, though. He has to fight Philistines and Canaanites, and they didn't finish their job during the period of the judges, and so he can't build a temple to God, so his son Solomon does. And Solomon's gifted with the wisdom, right? And so he knows what's right. And then he takes 700 wives and 300 concubines, and that's not good. But he gets to build the house of God, the temple, and it's built in a splendid way on Mount Zion, on the mountain in Jerusalem. Mount Moriah is another term that's used in Genesis chapter 22. You remember that? Abraham was asked to go sacrifice his son, his only son, and he made a 3-day journey from Beersheba all the way to where? What will become Jerusalem. It's Mount Moriah. And so where Solomon will build the Holy of Holies will be on the spot geographically, I think, where Abraham built an altar to sacrifice his son, but then God provided a ram in a thicket. Well, you remember the rest of the history. If David was the greatest moment in time, well, then after there it falls apart. The 2 kingdoms, Israel to the north, 10 northern tribes, Judah to the south, and then you have the history of without God, well, he's going to let all the pagan empires that are going to pop up on the scene of history. Here are some dates. By the time of Paul, the Jews had not been free since the 8th century before Christ. You see in red, the Assyrians came in 722 and took the northern tribes completely. And then they laid siege to Jerusalem around 701, and God didn't let them take Jerusalem, not yet. But they will have an overlord, a pagan, vicious overlord. The Jews will, the 10 northern tribes from the 8th century on. Even the southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin will think that they can do it on their own. And so God lets Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Babylonians come in the 6th century before Christ. This is a quick rundown of 2,000 years of history. If you had asked Paul, what does it mean to be a Jew? He would have to give you a quick summary of 2,000 years of history of his people, which is what this is, okay? The Persians came and defeated Babylon. They were only around for about 8 centuries, and King Cyrus the Great and then Darius, and they were nice. They were nicer than the Assyrians and Babylonians. They let the Jews go home. Not all of them did. Some of them remained parked out in Babylon. But some of them, a remnant, a contingent, went back and rebuilt the walls. Nehemiah rebuilt the temple, or started to. They rebuilt a little part of it, and it took 4 centuries. But Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah, those names should ring a bell. If Paul were to give a quick rundown of the story of his people, this is what he would say. And he would say, and finally temple worship was reestablished in the time of Ezra in the late 5th century before Christ. And now in his days, well, he was going to college with Gamaliel. They're doing the last touches, and never mind that the money that's being used is from Herod the Great, who's a very bad king and even Edomite and all of that. But here's the thing. Please make note of that last term down there. One temple in the Jewish religion, Jewish history. It can only be in Jerusalem. They're the only monotheists in the entire world. Everybody else is polytheists. They have many gods, and many gods to those many temples to those many gods. Jews are the one people. And synagogues, there are hundreds of them now because of the Babylonian exile. When Nebuchadnezzar was allowed to destroy by God the Jerusalem temple, and they were dispersed hundreds of miles, and Jerusalem was in ruin, then they figured out that without God, they were toast. And if they weren't going to be faithful to Torah and teach their children to do better than they had, they were going to be toast. And so they developed schools to teach their children, like, we need to do in our churches. We need to teach our children, because the secular schools are not going to do that. Our Bible classes, our homes, or whatever, they learned that in exile. Do you have to go into exile to get it? They did. And the synagogue is born as a institution that is not present in the Old Testament, by the way. You won't find the word synagogue in the Old Testament, but it exists in a strong presence in the New, because they said we have got to teach the children to be better and to observe the Mosaic law. And there it is. Okay, so there it is. Finish of the Jewish history of 2,000 years. God goes silent with whatever the last prophet was, right? I don't know if it's Malachi or Haggai, or I don't know, somewhere in the 4th century. And in the 4th century, the Greeks arrived with Alexander the Great. So that would be the 4th overlord of the Jews, 4th. And that won't be the last one. The Romans will come in 103 to Tarsus, and then Jerusalem in 63 before Christ. And that's the 5th overlord. So here's the quick review. They've been under pagan overlords for 8 centuries. When is this going to be over? When is there going to come, the Messiah, the anointed one, the ones that the prophet spoke about? That's why they started thinking in terms of a Roman general, or the conquering general that would defeat the Romans. Yeah, it's going to take God to do that. Nobody else can. So that's where they're at. The intertestamental period is the last phase. It's the space between the Old Testament and the New. The last prophet is around the 4th century. And then God speaks again with John the Baptist, right? Who pronounces the coming of the one, right? So God is silent about 330 years. And that must have been what I'd like to ask Paul when I get to heaven. I'm going to ask him this. When you were studying for your finals in the school of Gamaliel in Jerusalem, and in the year 27, you heard about a guy by the Jordan River that dressed like an Old Testament prophet, sounded like an Old Testament prophet. His name was John, and they had given him the name of the Baptist because he said, we got to change, and you're going to mark that change by immersion into water. What did you think? What did you think? Because, see, I know that Paul was trained in his Pharisee school to read the prophets and expect the Messiah. Okay? So, question. What did you think when you heard about John first? Okay? And then, when you heard about this carpenter, construction worker from Nazareth, and miracles, and what were you thinking? What'd you do? Okay, that's going to be the question. Okay, so I kind of walked through that history of Jews, but I wanted us to remember what it was like to be born in about the year 5 AD as a Jew in the Roman Empire. You had 8 centuries of dominators. The Romans were not the worst. They actually gave all kinds of freedoms to the Jews. And we're going to look at those real quick. So they're, of all the dominators, they're a lot better than the Assyrians, Babylonians, even the Persians, even the Greeks. The Romans are actually, not bad, but still, they when are we going to be free again? When are we going to be God's people again? When is he going to come? Messianic anticipation. When's the one going to come? What were you thinking when you studied in the school of Gamaliel in Jerusalem, in your PhD studies at that school? What were you thinking about those, the one, the anointed one, the Messiah to come? How did they, excuse me, what did they teach on Isaiah 53? Okay. By the way, if you want to read about the intertestamental period, the period between the Old Testament and the New, your major sources are the Jewish historian Josephus, and also another historian, Greco-Roman historian by the name of Philo. And you can read a couple of books that are in the Catholic Old Testament, not in the Protestant one, not in mine or yours. We're called Protestants by them. 7 books of the Old Testament were kind of vacated because they've been let into the canon of the Old Testament. And so instead of 39, they had 46. 2 of those are called First and Second Maccabees. And while they're not inspired, so they have errors in them, clearly they're not inspired, but they have interesting details about the intertestamental period, okay? So here's the important thing. When Paul was born, especially among Orthodox Jews, Pharisees, there was a strong messianic fervor, but not just in him, in a lot of Jews. When are we going to be free again? When's he going to come? He's got to come soon. 8 centuries. How much longer? Okay. The dispersion Jews were even much more than because for them to go to Jerusalem for one of the major Jewish holidays, like, for example, the number 1, Passover, which lasted 8 days. That was a long trip if you came from what we call North Africa or Babylon or Rome. Long trip. But that was the only temple you had. It was the only place where you could offer sacrifices for your sins. And so when is he going to come back? And so we're going to look at 2 different conflicting sects, SCCTS of Jews, Essenes and Zealots. I don't know if you're aware of those, but 2 different opposite views of the spectrum, extreme reactions. There are the terrorist Jews who want to kill all the Romans in the name of God, and there are the Essenes that are going to say, oh, forget the Romans, let's go make a monastery out by the Dead Sea and wait for the one to come, wait for the end of time, apocalyptic, so to speak, okay? But here, when Paul is born, please make note, there are 3 power brokers in Palestine at the time of Paul. 3 people that have real power, political power, meaning they can arrest, meaning they can kill, meaning they can tax, all of the above, okay? Obviously, the Romans have that power. They shoot first and ask questions later. But they also don't want to intervene if they don't have to. They don't micromanage. So, yes, you may never rebel. You must pay your taxes. Otherwise, we'll let your local kings, leaders, whatever, rule. So they let other rule under them. Number 2, why were there kings in the time of Paul? That had only been the case for about 150 years. They'd only been around for about 150 years. In fact, you could say kings, Jewish kings, had only been around for 150 years, like also the Pharisees and the Sadducees. All 3 of those, the 2 sects, 2 major sects in Paul's time, and the Jewish kings had only been around for about 150 years during the intertestamental times. You won't find any of those in the Old Testament. But they have power, like Herod the Great, when he wants to kill baby Jesus and misses, right? The estimate is that in Bethlehem, about 50 baby boys were ripped away from their mother's arms, and the henchmen of Herod the Great killed him because he was trying to kill somebody who was going to be a king. That's power. It's tragic power, and Herod the Great is giving account for that abuse with God as we speak. But what's the Sanhedrin? That's power too. Sanhedrin is the high court of the Jews. The Romans don't care about administering Jerusalem. The Jews are different. They're weird. They only have one God, and they're very peculiar about Roman gods, symbols, in downtown Jerusalem by their temple. So they let the Sanhedrin more or less rule, and they even have the power to arrest and execute. Is that right? Who's executed in Acts chapter 7? Who's stoned? Stephen is. By whom? Not the Romans, or not the Jewish kings. Sanhedrin is the supreme court of the Jews. We're going to look at that as an institution as well. Okay, so here it is. Things I've been referring to. Where did the synagogue come? When Paul was born, there were hundreds of them throughout the Greco-Roman world. The word synagoge in Greek means sitting together or gathering. It was born, as we said, out in the exile, Babylonian exile, didn't exist, not in the Old Testament. It was born as a school, education. Later, it will become a place of prayer and worship on the Sabbath. Okay? Because most people can't go to the temple every week because they live hundreds of miles away. So they're going to have to go to offer their sacrifices for their sins to Jerusalem. But that's on a major holiday. Okay? Kind of like the parents of Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee go once a year. And Jesus takes his apostles from Galilee once a year down to Jerusalem for the Passover feast. Okay? It takes a quorum of 10 that have had their bar mitzvah. So I put men in asterisk. We think of men as somebody, 18 or older. For them, it's when you are become responsible for the commandments of Moses. Bar mitzvah means son of commandment in Hebrew. Well, then you're a man. It took 10 men. 10 had bar mitzvah to have a synagogue. They had a rule. Can't have 9. Okay. The Talmud says, look at this, that's a Jewish literary source, that there were 480 synagogues in Jerusalem. Wow. Other sources say less, 365. Either way, there were hundreds of synagogues downtown Jerusalem, which tells you, yes, Jerusalem was about 200,000, because you can't get more than 100 to 150 in a synagogue. So there you go, okay? There were 11 in Rome, from one source. There were 18 in the city of Sepphoris. You say, where's Sepphoris? That is 4 miles from the city where Jesus will grow up in, Nazareth, just across the valley. It's a big city, much bigger than Nazareth. Nazareth was probably a one-school little village of 400. Okay, that's a educated guess. Sepphoris was a big city. It had 18 synagogues in it. And it was probably where Jesus did a lot of construction work with his father until his father passed away. Okay? Any comments? I'm showing you pictures of a synagogue. This one is one of the cities that Jesus will do miracles in. He will also put a woe on them because of the number of miracles he does in Bethsaida, Capernaum, and Chorazin. Chorazin? This is the synagogue in Chorazin? So here's the Romans destroyed all Jewish synagogues after 130, a rebellion of the Jews, the Bar Kokhba rebellion, but they were rebuilt by the Jews in the same spot, in the same way, same architecture. They're very traditional, Jews are. So they rebuilt. So this is a rebuilding of the 2nd century synagogue in the city of Chorazin, where Jesus did many miracles. This is what it looked like. There's the entrance. So the children would sit around. Education was done by memorization. You didn't get your own copy of the scroll of Isaiah. It was read to you. They did worship on Sabbath, which had preaching and reading and prayer and singing of psalms. Okay. This is a typical synagogue. Again, synagogues were born out of the need to teach their children, then became a worship center by the time of Christ. You're looking again at the Chorazin synagogue, the rebuilding of it. I think it's from the 4th century. So there we go. Yeah. Here is one of the things that was in most, if not all, synagogues. It was called Moses' seat. Usually that's where the synagogue leader would sit. You have, again, as a symbol of, again, they would read the Mosaic Law, the Pentateuch, as it's called, the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy being the prominent one. From age 5 up to 10 it was studying of the Torah from 10 to 15, rabbinic interpretations of the Torah. And then at 15, most, even girls, by the way, were educated up to, Jewish girls were fairly educated up to a certain level. In other cultures, it wasn't true. But in Jewish culture, it was, because you had to learn the Torah from about 5 to 10. Then from 10 to 15, it was interpretations, you could say commentaries of the Torah. And here is a remnant of a Moses seat in one of the in the Chorazin synagogue. Okay, so the synagogue is an institution of Paul's day. When he was born, there were hundreds of them, and he went to one in the city of, or one. He went to one, maybe there were more, but he went to one for sure in Tarsus. The temple only one. Judaism was always a temple religion. Now, God didn't always live on Mount Moriah. The temple wasn't always in Mount Moriah. Before, God lived in a tent. It's called the tabernacle, right? And it moved around in the desert, and then it settled on Mount Moriah. And then Solomon came along to build the permanent dwelling of God on Mount Moriah. That was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, and then it was rebuilt by Ezra and Zerubbabel and others until the time of Paul, time of Jesus. They were finishing the last touches. It had taken nearly 4 centuries, and it was splendid. Okay. Important distinction. You can't offer sacrifices for your sins in the synagogues. There's only one temple. You got to go to Jerusalem. Judaism was, let me say was, a temple religion. It's not been for the last 2,000 years, because they've not had a temple for 2,000 years. They've not had high priests. They've not had a priestly caste. They don't have it. They are a templeless religion now. But for hundreds of years, 1,000 years before, they'd been a temple religion. Okay, 3 major feasts. Don't worry about the minor ones. They are, of course, Passover. That's in about March, April of what our year is. The Jewish calendar is very different. But in the 15th day of Nisan, as they called it, Passover. Then 50 days later, Pentecost, right? Then the Feast of Tabernacles, which is late September, early October. So those are the 3 major feasts. And many Orthodox Jews went all 3 times in the calendar year, took 8 days off, because it's not 1 day. It's an 8-day thing. And they would go down and be in Jerusalem for the festivities, offer sacrifices to the temple. Now, those that lived in North Africa or Rome or Babylon couldn't do that, but they tried to go once in their lifetime or more on Passover, for real. Jerusalem swelled from 200,000 to 400,000 usually on Passover times, okay? Last item, the Sanhedrin. Doesn't exist in the Old Testament. Synagogue doesn't exist in the Old Testament. The Sanhedrin is 70 men plus the high priest. Important. In the time when Paul is born, when he goes to college, when his parents pay a high tuition at the school of Gamaliel, what do they want him to do with it? They want him to rise to the highest level. This group right here, the Sanhedrin. They want him to be on the Supreme Court of the Jews. He achieves it by all effects. Let me tell you why. When he's at Stephen's stoning, he's not throwing stones. Is that right? He's holding coats. You remember? So he's not a full member of the Sanhedrin yet, because he's only holding coats. Later on, he's going to arrest and put people in prison. Then he is a full member of the Sanhedrin. In the transition between Acts 7 and Acts 8, he becomes a full member, and he's of the party of the Pharisees. The Sanhedrin is composed of 2 major parties, Pharisees and Sadducees. Pharisees, by all accounts, are the greater number. Sadducees are the minority in number. However, the high priest can only come from the Sadducees. Therefore, the Sadducees control the temple. because they control the temple guard and they determine everything that goes on in the house of God. That makes him highly influential. The people love the Pharisees, but the reality is, as a Jew, you got to go to temple. That's where God is. It's where you offer sacrifice. The high priest is the only one. You go in once a year to offer sacrifices. So that's the story. Okay. I think I'll stop here. Seems like a good spot. And we'll pick up here next time. Do you have any comments or questions? I really look forward to when we start next Monday. What are your reactions to Wright? I'm hoping that he is a blessing to you to spur your thinking, encourage you, because I know I can't do that, but maybe a different voice, he can do that. And by all means, read the first 3 chapters if you can, but definitely give me your reactions to the introduction. Okay. Any comments of yours?
Just a question about why would the people love the Pharisees?
They were seen as you and I are not tainted, we're enlightened by Jesus' take on the Pharisees. Here's the thing. The Pharisees used to be the good guys. They were the guys who said, don't let culture influence your faith. And culture has permeated Orthodox Judaism and definitely has permeated the Sadducees. The Sadducees only read the Torah, don't care about the prophets, don't have any expectation of the Messiah, and they love what the Romans have given them, which is full Jerusalem. And they're wealthy. They love status quo, couldn't care less to change things. They love their position. They are the ecclesiastical aristocracy. They have great livings, great salaries, great homes. And they have power over the people. You got to come to them to get to God. The Pharisees, however, are the ones that can study day in and day out. They study the Bible and the Old Testament, and the Old Testament, and they are seen as the theologians, the ones most respected because of their study habits and their knowledge. What you and I know, that the Pharisees have that or have had that, but they now have a significant problem too, which Jesus exposes, right? The Sabbath is a God thing, but what have the Pharisees done? They've added 39 rules to the Sabbath with good intentions, but they shouldn't have done that. And Jesus comes along and says, what? You're not the lords of the Sabbath, I am. Right? See, they think they have become lords of the Sabbath. So they used to be the good guys. And the people still esteem them. You remember when Jesus says to the apostles, you're going to have to pray better than the Pharisees? What do you think the reaction of the apostles was? Say what? Say again? Jesus has to dismantle the Pharisees in their eyes, because they think that the point of arrival is the Pharisees. They're the theologians. There's only like 12,000 of them, and they're all highly skilled and literate, and they stand on corners and pray, And Jesus says, watch out for the prayer. You're going to have to either prayers that are better than the Pharisees, you're going to have to give better than the Pharisees, and you're going to have to show your piety in a better way than Pharisees. And the apostles are like, how on earth are we supposed to do that? Jesus says, well, watch out. They do things to be seen by men, and God doesn't fall for that. Some of the Pharisees had fallen into a facade, but they used to be the good guys.
Thank you.
You're welcome.